The night started like any other, with the usual hum of life surrounding Mark Lawson as he sat at the bar, nursing a cold beer. The low buzz of conversation and clinking of glasses created a familiar rhythm in the air. But deep inside, Mark knew this evening wouldn't be like the others. He could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that made his senses tingle. Something wasn't right. The city of Virginia Beach was busy, as always. The humid summer air hung heavily over the streets, the noise of the busy traffic mixing with the laughter and chatter from nearby cafes and shops. Mark had retired just a few weeks ago after serving 20 years as a Navy sniper. The war stories, the high-stakes missions, and the moments of intense focus had all become distant memories. But despite the civilian life he was now attempting to embrace, his training had never left him. It was like an instinct, constantly alert, forever ready to react. As he sipped his drink, Mark's mind wandered. He thought about the past, about the quiet moments between missions, about the people he'd left behind. He'd served in some of the most dangerous corners of the world, but here, in the comfort of his own city, he hoped he could escape the weight of that life. His reputation as one of the most skilled snipers in the Navy preceded him, but today he wasn't in uniform. He wasn't a soldier or a weapon. He was just a man looking for peace. But peace, it seemed, was a rare commodity in the world he now found himself in. Suddenly, the door to the bar swung open, and a loud voice cut through the chatter. A man stumbled in, visibly drunk, his clothes disheveled. He was shouting something incoherent, drawing the attention of the patrons around him. Mark, ever the observer, instinctively sized him up. The man was clearly agitated, waving his arms and getting dangerously close to some of the other customers. A couple of the bar's regulars stood up, trying to calm him down, but it was clear this was no ordinary confrontation. The situation was escalating fast. The man was becoming increasingly hostile, his words slurred but his body language all too familiar to Mark. He'd seen this before, drunk, angry, and about to go too far. His hand instinctively moved to the side of his seat as his eyes scanned the room, assessing. The bar's bouncers had already approached, but they were too slow. Mark's military training kicked in without thinking. He stood up, a sense of calm confidence flowing through him. He made his way toward the commotion, not to engage in the fight, but to defuse it. He was always taught to assess, to be the calm in the storm, and right now, that's what was needed. His towering presence cut through the chaos, his broad shoulders and steady steps making him an immediate figure of authority. The man paused for a moment, looking Mark up and down. But before any words could be exchanged, a police officer burst into the scene, his eyes scanning for the troublemaker. The officer didn't recognize Mark, nor did he give him the chance to explain. "Stay back, sir," the officer barked, his tone harsh and commanding. Mark froze, taken aback. He hadn't done anything wrong, but here he was suddenly being addressed as if he were part of the problem. The officer didn't see a retired sniper. He didn't see a former Navy SEAL. He only saw a big guy standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Before Mark could say a word, the officer grabbed his arm and yanked it behind his back, slapping on the cuffs. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark said, his voice calm but firm, trying to explain, but the officer wasn't listening. Mark could feel his heart rate rise, but he held his ground, trying to stay composed. He had been in life-threatening situations before, but this wasn't one of them. This was a mistake, a misunderstanding. The officer didn't seem to care. With a violent push, Mark was shoved down to the ground, face first. The rough concrete scraped against his cheek, and the officers around him began piling in, holding him down, making sure he was subdued. This wasn't a fight he was in, but it was a fight he was losing, and he knew it. The situation was spiraling beyond control. The cop, so focused on the perceived threat, didn't see who he was dealing with. "Hey, this is a mistake." Mark's voice rang out, but the officers didn't hear him. They were too wrapped up in the power struggle of controlling the situation, and Mark could do nothing but comply. He wasn't resisting. He had been trained not to resist, even when things went wrong. The humiliation was the hardest part. Here, he was a decorated officer of the Navy, someone who had lived through countless dangers and came out victorious, now being treated like a common criminal. He was shoved into the back of the squad car, still cuffed, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. The cool metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, but Mark didn't flinch. He had seen worse. But this was different. This wasn't supposed to happen in his hometown, not to him, and certainly not after everything he had done for his country. The car drove through the streets, its siren flashing as it moved through the night. Mark stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Virginia Beach pass by, but they no longer felt like home. They felt distant, like everything had shifted in the blink of an eye. As the patrol car pulled into the precinct, Mark was escorted to a holding cell. He stood there, bewildered, his mind racing with questions. How had things escalated this far? How had he ended up in a jail cell, accused of something he hadn't done? But most importantly, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a mistake. This was a turning point. He had been wronged, and it was clear that the wheels of justice were going to turn slowly, if at all. Mark leaned against the cold wall, his hands still numb from the cuffs. His mind raced through every possible outcome, every scenario where this could end in his favor. But for now, he remained silent, waiting. He had been in enough battles to know that this was far from over. It wasn't just about getting out of this cell, it was about something bigger, something that would change the way people saw him. And as he sat there, stewing in the confusion and anger, one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. Inside the stark, sterile room of the police station, Mark sat quietly, still handcuffed, his body tense with anger, not at the officers, but at the situation that had spiraled out of control. He wasn't accustomed to being in such a helpless position. His mind was a whirlwind, replaying the chain of events that led to this moment. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, but now, here he was, sitting in a cold cell, wrongly accused and treated like a criminal. How had things gone so wrong? Mark tried to keep his focus, fighting the urge to let his anger get the best of him. There was no point in reacting to this with rage. He had been trained to remain calm in the most intense of situations. But this felt different. The system had failed him, and the frustration of it gnawed at him. He kept thinking about the people who had put him here, about the officers who saw him as just another threat, not recognizing who he really was. But his thoughts were interrupted when the door to the room creaked open. A man stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the room immediately shifted. The tension was palpable and Mark could feel it. This wasn't just any officer, this was someone who commanded respect. The man's uniform gleamed with the insignia of a high-ranking officer, the gleam of power and authority. The officers who were present stiffened, their posture becoming rigid at the sight of this figure. Mark stood instinctively, his military training kicking in as he immediately recognized the man. General Peterson, one officer whispered under his breath, and Mark could sense the admiration and respect in their voice. General Peterson was a name Mark had heard of, one that carried weight. A four-star general, a man of reputation, leadership, and integrity. He wasn't just an officer, he was a legend in his own right, a man who had earned the respect of everyone around him, both inside and outside the military. Mark stood a little straighter, unsure of what to expect, but knowing that this man was here for a reason. General Peterson wasted no time with pleasantries. His eyes, filled with a rare form of regret, moved to Mark. Without a word, he stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the ex-sniper as he addressed him directly. Sergeant Lawson, the general began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of sincerity. "I owe you an apology." Mark, stunned by the unexpected words, didn't know how to respond at first. His mind raced, trying to process the situation. What was this? An apology from a four-star general? For what? For a mistake? He was still trying to make sense of it. "I've reviewed the situation, and this shouldn't have happened. You were wrongly detained by officers who didn't know who you were," General Peterson continued, his voice low and calm. Mark could see the genuine remorse in the general's eyes. "I take full responsibility for the actions of the men under my command." Mark's mind swirled with emotions, confusion, disbelief, and then a deep, quiet acceptance. He had never expected an apology, especially not from someone of this caliber. He had always worked in silence, in the background, doing what was needed without recognition or praise. But now, here was a man of high rank taking responsibility for the mistake that had put him in this position. I've served with men like you, Sergeant, the general went on, his voice now filled with a sense of camaraderie. Men who put everything on the line for our country, men who are more than willing to sacrifice everything for the mission. And I'll be damned if we let a mistake like this tarnish the respect that is owed to you. Mark couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. The general's words were like a balm to his wounds, soothing the raw edges of his frustration. But at the same time, he felt a deep sense of discomfort. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and the recognition he was receiving now felt strange. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, that respect should come from how you lived your life, not from how others spoke of you. I appreciate the apology, General, Mark said, his voice steady, though the weight of the situation still hung heavily on him. But it's not about me. It's about what this represents. It's about ensuring that this doesn't happen to anyone else who served their country. General Peterson nodded, a small but meaningful gesture. He understood exactly what Mark was saying. The mistake was not just an error in procedure, it was a failure in how people who served in the military were treated. The general, in his position, understood that the respect and dignity afforded to veterans should never be compromised, no matter the circumstances. We're going to make sure the officers involved understand the gravity of this mistake, the general said, his voice firm, yet compassionate. And you'll have the highest level of clearance to ensure you're never treated this way again. Mark felt the cuffs loosen around his wrists, and as they were removed, he couldn't help but notice the way the officers who had wronged him now looked at him. Their faces were a mixture of respect and embarrassment, as though they realized the gravity of what had happened. But there was no time for that. The general had already made it clear that this wasn't about assigning blame, it was about correcting the wrongs and ensuring that the same mistake would never be made again. As Mark walked out of the station, free to go, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The system had faltered, yes, but it had also corrected itself. He had been humiliated, treated unjustly, and yet he walked out with his head held high. The general's words had reassured him, and although the night had been chaotic, it had ended with a sense of dignity restored. The officers who had once seen him as a threat now saw him for who he truly was, a man who had given years of service to his country, a man who deserved respect. And in that moment, Mark realized something important. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on the front lines. Sometimes they're fought in moments like this, when you reclaim your dignity and ensure that others are treated with the respect they deserve. The incident wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what it represented. It was about ensuring that those who had given their lives in service weren't forgotten, weren't treated as mere criminals or troublemakers. It was a fight for respect, for dignity, for the truth to be known. Mark didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would never let this incident define him. He had walked through it with integrity, and now he had a new purpose. His voice, his story would be heard. If you want to hear more stories of incredible resilience and courage, follow us on our journey. This story is just one of many, and there are more to come. Keep tuned to Expect Stories, where we bring to you narratives that inspire, challenge, and ultimately remind us all that sometimes the greatest battles are the ones we fight for our own dignity. Thank you for being part of the journey.